You figure out the thing you're working on at the time, and you write it down.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so. That's true. So you're doing the color of the bay, and I went and looked at it this morning. It's light gray because it's chilly but it's sunny, so light gray, classy light gray.
Chilly but funny.
Yeah.
The color of the bay.
Yeah, color of the bay.
I have to ask, does the bay laugh at you?
No. It'll drown you though. Water's going. Are you ready?
That I know.
Okay. She's going to give me thumbs up here. And are we live?
Yes.
All righty, here we go, guys. Welcome.
Recording started.
Recorded live.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation or around the world. Once again, you're listening to the VMware Communities Roundtable podcast. This is podcast number 499.5. My name is Eric Nilsson, and I have my co-host today, Ishmael. Ishmael, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about yourself, Eric?
Doing really good, really good. It is a wonderful day today. Today we're going to be talking about vSphere and Kubernetes. We have Eric Shanks on the call today, and he's a senior field engineer, part of the Cloud Native Applications BU. So we've got Eric on the call, and I'm excited to talk about all things vSphere 2020 and how Kubernetes is going to roll into that. So we've got Project Pacific coming down the pike. I know that we're going to be having a large announcement on March 10th. So we're continuing this thread of talking about new things in vSphere as well as Kubernetes. And Eric is an expert at both of these. Has a great blog article out there. But we'll get to Eric in a second. Before we do that, Ismail, what's color of the bay?
The color of the bay today is light gray. It's a brisk 42 degrees outside here, but very sunny. Birds are chirping outside, so it's a great day to be in the South Bay.
It is a good California day because it's just so sunny and bright. But at the same time, if you look at our temperature range, it's like 31 degrees at 4 in the morning, and then it creeps up to 42, 43. But California sun, bright and sunny. If you stand out, you're going to get warm.
Oh yeah, and you can see Eric is in a t-shirt right now. So,
I am. That's right. The sun here. If you ever want to see what we look like, we live stream this out on YouTube now, so you can go give us a follow on YouTube. We'll post it on some of the social outside. I don't think we have a URL that I can list quickly, but go check us out, and you can see that the mountains are in the background. It is very sunny and bright today. So very, very happy to be in California. Of course, not much rain going on, so we always worry a little bit about that. Right? We had a wet December, so it's been good.
It was right before New Year's and right before the holidays. We got a little bit of storm.
If I look at my reservoir chart, the reservoir chart says that it's we're right on spec. Right, we're 3/4 full.
Yeah,
so
it's
good.
coming though.
Right.
We have late winters and late rain here.
Yeah.
So
but now we got sun, and more sun, so that's good for a little while as well. I also raise honeybees, and the honeybees like a little break in between winter to get out and do some work. So.
When are we gonna get to try some of your
never.
homemade honey?
No,
come on.
We're not never bringing that in here.
Oh, come on.
I give away jars to my friends, but you haven't got there yet. Yeah, if you do a good job, we'll do that. So.
All right.
All right, getting on with the show. Eric Shanks, Senior Field Engineer, CNBU. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Seems like you've got a little bit better weather than we do in Chicago today.
I bet. My son, my last son, I have 4 kids. My son got into University of Chicago, so we've been trying to explain to him that it's going to be pretty cold up there sometimes, right? So, how's your weather up in Chicago? Is the temperature above freezing?
I think it's right around freezing. It's a little windy today. Everything is gray. There's no sunshine, anything like that.
All right. Well,
typical
thanks,
Chicago winter.
Thanks for being up there and doing field engineering work for us up there. And why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are? How long have you been at VMware and the ecosystem? How did you get where you are in your career? And then we'll dive into Kubernetes next. But tell us a little bit about yourself. This is a community podcast, so people want to know, who are you?
Yeah, so I'm Eric Shanks. Like you said, I'm a senior field engineer with VMware. I've only been with VMware for about 4 or 5 months now, working on Kubernetes most of the day. Prior to that, I was a consultant here in Chicago for a partner, and I focused on vSphere stuff then. I did a lot of vRealize automation work. I wrote 2 Pluralsight courses for vRealize automation, and then kind of jumped into some AWS architecture after that. I was a VMUG leader for 4 years here in Chicago, VCDX number 195.
Congrats, nice.
That's about it, I think.
Yeah, but that's saying a lot, right? You know, VCDX, you're a numbered guy, right? And that's like making the mob, I guess, right? Like, you know, you get numbered, right? You got made, so you're VCDX. You've been doing vSphere for quite a while, obviously. Then we stole you away from a partner, as we do for many people, and now you're at VMware and you're into Kubernetes. So one of the things that I always like to get from people is like, when you were doing vSphere, how did you end up starting to pay attention to Kubernetes and start, you know, learning about enough to end up getting a job in the cloud native apps BU?
Sure, fair question. So yeah, I did vSphere for a long time. I was a system administrator before I was ever a consultant. And that's where I kind of cut my teeth on vSphere. I went and did consulting on vSphere for a long time, and I kind of got to a point where I was ready to do the next thing. The next thing for me ended up being automation and cloud. Right, most of the customers I was talking to at the time, they had these 2 factions that were kind of warring with each other in a manner of speaking. Where you've got developers who were saying, "I want to deploy my applications much faster," and the infrastructure teams that are spinning up VMs, but there's ticketing systems and things that slow that process down. So I kind of fit in the middle where we were trying to stitch those things together, which is why I kind of got into vRealize automation, right? My goals there were around taking a virtual machine and coupling all the enterprise things around it that you needed to have for a VM to be, promoted to production, like change ticketing, CMDB entries, added to backup routines, added to like your SRM, DR strategies, all of those other things that are around the VM. And then hand it off to the developer. And then I moved into cloud, which is all API driven. I started working a lot of things with AWS, and starting to write code and YAML manifests and things like that. When I was doing those things, I was talking to customers, and there was still kind of this gap. Some of those customers were saying, "Oh, well, our developers are now writing containers." And our infrastructure folks, a lot of times these were BI admins that were now maybe deploying still on vSphere, but also in the cloud. And they were used to just spinning up VMs. There was a gap kind of in between those. So, somebody's spinning up your infrastructure and somebody's building containers. Who's running the container orchestration engine? And that's kind of how I dove into Kubernetes originally.
Oh, interesting. It does ring true in that every once in a while in our careers we have to look at like what's next, right? And spend time looking at it, what's next, and picking some technology that you're interested in to solve some of the next problems. So it sounds like you went through that. I kind of went through that last year where I was playing with ARM, right? Where ARM is coming. I think our next show is going to be talking about ARM and ESX on ARM and Raspberry Pi 4s. But it's like you have to pick a technology that's moving forward, and I think we all have to do this because technology, that's the definition of technology, where it's moving. If you stay stagnant for too long, it won't be technology anymore. It'll be a commodity, right?
You become stagnant.
Yeah, you become stagnant. Exactly. So it sounds like you went through that transition. Were you actually then working with customers at your previous place, at the partner, and then were doing some of that, and then got hired into VMware while you were spending your time at customer sites doing Kubernetes? Is that how that looked like? What it looked like for you?
Yeah, it kind of started that way. So, most of the time my job was to make sure that we could stitch together the development teams and the infrastructure teams together so they could work and do more DevOps-y type things.
Right.
It ended up being, here was the problem, and it was my job to architect a solution around that. So it wasn't that I was like, I'm all in on Kubernetes. It was more, this is what my customers need.
Right.
So let me figure out solutions to help them understand this or fix this. And that's where I started diving into the Kubernetes architecture and things a little bit more, and obviously a lot more since I've joined VMware.
Right, right. All right. Well, that's a nice history, and good to understand how you got there. And I think a lot of virtual administrators that we work with are probably looking and wondering, where do they stick their toe in, and how do they move forward? And we'll talk about that next, which is obviously Kubernetes, and we'll get into Kubernetes on vSphere. But in learning Kubernetes, are there kind of some of the things that that you experienced was there like a learning curve where at first you were dabbling, looking at it from VMware perspective, and then you start understanding what it is and how it works, and then were there some aha moments there? Could you take us through kind of your experience? Because I think most people that are listening to this podcast probably are at various phases of this journey too. Like, I haven't done anything. So what was your experience like when you started to learn about it, and were there some aha moments that you started to understand as you got deeper into it?
Yeah, I think at one point Eric Wright had called me an IT pragmatist, which was pretty accurate with me, right? I'm not the person that's going to go jump on the newest technology just to see what it's like and kind of spend my time learning something that's going to fail later on. Kubernetes got to a point where I decided, look, this isn't just a project people are messing around with. This is a thing that I think is going to be important going forward. And that's one of the things where I started saying, okay, I really need to learn this thing. But I had plenty of challenges, right? So, background in vSphere, IaaS type infrastructure. When I started learning Kubernetes, I didn't have a real good background in just containers. So learning how containers function is kind of a prerequisite to doing anything in Kubernetes, right? You can kind of learn those together, but really what you're trying to do is, can I stand up a basic container on Docker? And once you get to that point, then you're probably ready to start learning more about the Kubernetes orchestrator and things like that.
Yeah,
the challenges I've
no, that makes sense.
Yeah, the challenges that I had faced were really around not so much learning the pieces around Kubernetes, like this is what a pod is or a replica set or a deployment. Those things came fairly straightforward to me as you just start going through documentation and learning things and going through videos and things. The challenges that I had were more around ancillary things that are around Kubernetes that I just didn't have a ton of experience with, right? So I was a Windows administrator when I started out as a system administrator. So just some Linux bash type commands and things were a little bit foreign to me, right? I'm working with JSON path arguments and things now in Kubernetes. You have to be able to understand how to use Git for the most part because you're going to store manifest files. How do I, mess with YAML and have issues with spacing versus tabs and things like that? That it was all the blockers around Kubernetes that for me were hard to shift from my old way of doing vSphere to now.
That's actually interesting because I come from a Linux background because I worked at Sun Microsystems and did OS development and C and shell and all the Linux commands. So like I'm not a Windows. I used Windows a lot of times, but you're interesting in that if you in VMware obviously virtualized Windows environments on VMs, right? That's probably 80% of our business. And the shift to modern apps is really a Linux-based business, right? Where the foundation tends to be Linux OSs with containers built in, and then you get tar files and zip files and shell commands and shell scripts and all of the things that you need to learn to become proficient enough to live in this environment. I think most of that, am I wrong in that, or is that a kind of an accurate statement that most of the world when you move into containers is running on Linux right today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think most of pretty much all the engagements that I've worked on right now have been Linux containers. There is some support for Windows containers, but I just don't see that as often kind of out in the field.
Right.
So I would say a high percentage of that is Linux.
Right, and there's just a learning curve that happens because we take some of the people that I've worked with and hired on our team, and then try to introduce them to the whole Linux world, and it takes 3 months to get those things down. And it's interesting that you mentioned containers and understanding what a container is in Linux, and then Docker and what is a Docker file. And is Docker file isn't it just a tarred zip file of everything that gets pulled down and then gets untarred and unzipped and untarred and then layered onto a container? Am I missing things that defines a Docker file?
Yeah, so Docker file is really just a text file that's going to have a list of commands and data in it. When you run a Docker build, it's going to read that Docker file, and then it's going to go and create your Docker image. And the image is going to be, a zip file full of those layers of whatever was in the Docker file.
Right.
So that's how you build that container originally.
Right. The Docker file.
You're basically creating a desired state text file.
Right. The Docker file is the text file that's in YAML that defines what's going to go in. But what I was referring to is the thing that it's bringing down, which I like to call a Docker file, but it's really I don't know what they call the tar file that has all the bits plus the instructions to run once it gets down and you unpack it and run it. But that thing is actually just a tar file that's been zipped, right? And if you're from Unix, Linux land, that's very, very familiar concept, right? Like, oh, this is just a tar file that's coming down. And then we have rules. The Docker file is actually the rule set that actually creates the tar file. So very natural for us, but I bet from a Windows admin perspective, that's like all new, right?
Yeah, a little confusing the first time you look at it if you're not familiar with Linux. Yeah.
Right.
But you got it exactly right. It builds that image file, which is just a tar that it brings down, and you can instantiate it.
So I want to step back a minute and also mention you do have a really nice blog, the ithollow.com, the ithollo.com. Nice. How long have you been blogging? And were you blogging already on vSphere? Obviously, you're VCDX. VCDX, is that right? Yeah. And you've been putting out articles. Were you doing articles before you came to VMware on virtualization? And now you have some really great articles on Kubernetes. We'll talk about that in a minute. How long have you been blogging? And give us some history there.
Yeah, so actually next week I think will be my 8-year anniversary. So I've been blogging for 8 years. And if you really wanted to know what was on my blog, it's my career path.
Got it.
I started off doing vSphere stuff and Windows administration. There's some, Microsoft, like Active Directory and blog posts and things in there from way back. But if you follow the order of them, you'll see vSphere posts, and then you'll see some VRA guides and posts, and you'll see some AWS stuff, and now you'll see Kubernetes. So kind of follows me.
Right. Now, when you started running Kubernetes, where did you actually run Kubernetes? Were you doing it on AWS, or how did you get your feet wet in your first Kubernetes instance?
Yeah, so the very first Kubernetes deployment I ever did was in AWS, and I used kops to do that. I won't do that anymore, but that was the first time I deployed it. I basically was following a manual that said, here's how you deploy Kubernetes. Because the things I started learning with were, the things that go in Kubernetes. Like how do I get a container stood up in a pod in a Kubernetes cluster? Well, before you can ever mess around or play with that, you have to actually deploy a Kubernetes cluster. And I used the easiest method that I knew at the time, which was through kops to deploy an AWS cluster. Since then, most of my work I do in vSphere because I've got a home lab, and I can spin those things up without having to pay an OpEx cost for them.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we've had trouble with is that there wasn't really an easy way to get Kubernetes without getting new infrastructure, right? So you have your home lab and you have vSphere as an IT practitioner or an evangelist influencer, but it wasn't you weren't going to throw away your vSphere lab in order to run Kubernetes. So I got started running it on Raspberry Pis, where we actually got Raspberry Pis and managed to get Kubernetes running on them. And that was get my feet wet. The problem with the cloud is expensive, right? you have to actually spend real money out of my wallet to go to Amazon and spin up something that then gives me Kubernetes on it. So it's interesting now that you got it running on vSphere. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got that spun up, what you have to do to make that work, and what's your impressions of it? And were you part of the beta program for vSphere 7, or were you just running it on top? I know it runs on top of vSphere.
Yeah, I'm running it right now on vSphere 6.7 update 3.
Okay.
And really, to deploy a Kubernetes cluster, you can kind of stand up the bits through the kubeadm tool on really any sort of machine. So it could be a bare metal machine, it could be a vSphere virtual machine, it could be a vSphere or an AWS EC2 instance or whatever. So that part doesn't really matter. It's a little agnostic between
right.
what provider you're actually running it on.
Right, because this is just running on the OS. Whatever. If you get a Linux there, it just sits on a VM, runs Linux, and then you run it on top of that. Right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Absolutely. That's right. Absolutely. Now, for most implementations, if you're doing this for a customer, or you're trying to do some sort of production grade type installation, you would use some additional hooks, right? Because the cloud provider, vSphere included, can provide additional functionality to your Kubernetes cluster once it's been deployed if Kubernetes knows how to talk to that cloud provider's API. So, for instance, you can do things like if I deploy a Kubernetes service that's of type load balancer in an AWS instance, if you've set up the cloud provider, that means AWS will spin up like an elastic load balancer and connect it to your applications. And all you have to do is apply a manifest to Kubernetes. It does the rest with the cloud provider. Now, obviously, it's harder to do that on vSphere because there's not a native load balancer in vSphere. You could think NSX in the future, probably.
Right.
But you can do additional things depending on what cloud provider it is. You could do things around storage and things as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, good. One other question I've had is the network fabric, right? They always talk about needing a network plugin. Do you know how that works and why you need that? I mean, I needed to do it, and I forget what we used on Raspberry Pi to have the network fabric set up, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what you did. What you did there to make pod communications work properly. You do need some kind of network plugin.
Yeah, so basically the pod communication is really about how pods communicate with each other across nodes, right? So if I've got, if I had a single Docker instance stood up, Docker's got a bridge that'll be used, which is an internal switch basically that says, hey, these containers can talk to each other. It gets a little more difficult when you've got two different nodes that each have containers running on them. You need a way to bridge those two different nodes together. And that's what that container networking interface is used for. And there's a variety of different CNIs that you can use. VMware's is NSX-T, but there's also open source ones out there. Flannel is common if you're getting started and you're learning things. Calico is another one. Calico is my CNI of choice when I'm running it in my lab, which some of these CNIs can do additional things, like Calico provide the opportunity to use things like network policies, so you can block traffic between namespaces. They all kind of have their own pros and cons.
So to explain this in VM terms, this is just like a virtual switch between VMs, right? Is that kind of a way to think about it? But it's a virtual switch for containers and the pods and Kubernetes, where they just need to build a virtual network between the nodes that then let pod applications talk across nodes securely, and then you have a virtual switch there that's kind of doing that work. Is that another way of explaining it to people?
Yeah, you can think of it that way, where basically it's a virtual switch inside of each one of those Linux hosts, and it's routing traffic between pods that are inside of that host, and it's got to also advertise those addresses to other nodes that are in your cluster, so that if a pod on a different node needs to know how to talk to a pod on the node you're on, it'll know what route to get to, or what route to take to get there.
Right, right. Yeah, that was the biggest thing for me as we were getting it set up, understanding that, oh, there's this other layer. The other things, if you know Linux, it was actually reasonably easy. And I know VMs, I've got my own home lab and so I did this last year where I took my first step into Kubernetes. And so, yeah, the networking thing was a little bit hard to understand. And then the other piece that I struggled with was pod definition. A pod is not what I thought it was. You know, you think pod, you think hardware, you think nodes in a pod, right? But the pod definition is really your application and all the resources the application needs. And so a pod has a definition of some hardware, but it's from an application perspective, right? Do I have that right? Because I'm only a little bit into this, so I was just curious what your thoughts were on that.
So you think of a pod as the lowest unit of measure in a Kubernetes cluster. So if you were just doing a Docker cluster and there's no container orchestration involved, you've got a container. That's the lowest level. In Kubernetes wraps all the containers in a pod. So it's very common to see a pod with a container in it. And that's the boundary for Kubernetes. But you can also have pods that have multiple containers in them, but they share the same network namespace. So, for instance, if I had one pod with two containers in it, those two containers can't use the same port because it's sharing the same network namespace. So I could have port 80 and port 443 on the two different containers, and that would work fine. But a pod basically wraps your containers.
Okay, and then I think a pod you can attach an application into the pod definition. So then that's even a higher level abstract where a pod can be the nodes plus the image of your application all tied together, right? At least that's the way I thought it was working.
If you're creating a pod manifest,
right.
Within that pod manifest, you'll have a specification for the container that you're going to run. So the pod will say, "Hey, I'm going to go spin this thing up. What's going to be inside?" And then you'll have a spec for the container, and the container will say, "Here's the image," right? Okay. And that image should be the thing that you built earlier from your Docker file.
Makes
right?
sense. Got it.
So you built that Docker file ahead of time, you pushed it to a registry, and then when you apply this manifest, it reads the manifest and says, the container's using this image, go get it.
Okay, great. And for people, and then we'll bump off this subject now because it isn't just a full Kubernetes conversation here. But thanks for enlightening me a little bit. And for people that want to go learn this, the ithollow.com you do have a couple intro to Kubernetes blog posts there, which are great. That kind of give you block diagrams of how things are working and explaining the terms and how to learn. So I would encourage people to go look at some of your articles right on the blog, because you did a nice job taking people through kind of, not a basic, but kind of an intermediate basic view of how things are working and from an architecture perspective. So anything to add there? Do you continue to post articles on Kubernetes on your blog? Are you going to do some advanced topics as well?
Yeah, you can expect there'll be additional Kubernetes topics in here as things progress. I do have a guide called Getting Started with Kubernetes. If you pull that one up, you can see that basically I'll take you through, you've got a couple options for setting up a cluster, and the rest of the posts in that series will show you how things work, basically. And we'll start with a pod, and then you'll kind of build on top of those things. So once you understand how a pod works, you can learn about replica sets. And then once you learn about replica sets, you'll learn about deployments, because they all kind of encapsulate each other. So if you follow these in order, it should give you a pretty good understanding of how all the different things in Kubernetes can work and how you can utilize those to build your own solutions.
Okay, good. So we'll talk. I want to go talk a little bit about Project Pacific, because we're just talking about the way Kubernetes behave. Then we'll talk about your blog article, deploying Kubernetes on vSphere. But deploying Kubernetes on vSphere or in vSphere. So Project Pacific is the idea that Kubernetes is just part of vSphere. I don't really understand that, because this all runs on top of an operating system. Do you know much about that? And you might not. We haven't pre-staged this question. I'm just curious. What's the difference between Pacific versus just running, Kubernetes on top of a Linux that's running on vSphere?
Sure. Yeah. So VMware is building Project Pacific, and they're taking what we've learned from Kubernetes over the years, and we're making those things native tools that are built directly into vSphere and into ESXi. So, for instance, in a normal Kubernetes cluster, you have this thing called a kubelet that runs on every single node in the cluster. It basically sends communications to the master control plane nodes that says, "Hey, I'm alive," and they do other things about spinning up the containers. In the vSphere world, we're running ESXi. ESXi in the newest version will have this thing called a spherelet. And the spherelet is a VMware version of the kubelet that can do basically the same types of jobs, spinning up containers directly on the ESXi nodes. And technically, you wouldn't have to have any other Kubernetes infrastructure available. The spherelet can do that with vCenter. So
Okay.
we're going to be seeing some cool things there.
Right. So instead of needing the Linux operating system that then runs a container that then runs another micro operating system with your application on it, we're basically just saying, hey, this, what do we call it? VLET? Spherelet?
It was a cute name. I don't know.
Cute name.
Spherelet.
Spherelet. A spherelet. So you have the spherelet that's now running that will, take the replace of that base operating system, right? And now you just pull down your Docker image, which has a microkernel in it that runs and then runs your app, but you don't need that other operating system underneath it to launch Kubernetes because we've got a spherelet running there, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Nice.
You basically got that. I'm not trying to tell you right now that that's the way you should run your containers. I'm saying that is an option. That's one of the things we're going to be able to do, right? So you can anticipate that we can run things like control plane objects and things directly on your ESXi nodes.
Right. So instead of
you're going to have for Pacific, though, is you can.
Got it. So what you're saying is that you wouldn't typically run your app down at that level, but there are a lot of other services that you might want to run that are control plane related services that you might want to run down there without. Yeah, and that makes sense, right? Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
All right.
And Pacific's also going to let us do things like spin up guest clusters. So vSphere will know, how have an opinionated way of deploying a Kubernetes cluster for you. So you'll be able to quickly spin up a guest cluster right from vCenter, and you won't have to go through these kubeadm tools or the COPS method and things that we've done in the past.
All right, that makes sense. Right, so that explains to me, because I struggle with what does it actually mean to have, say, it's going to be in vSphere, but spherelets, right? And then being able to run container-based services directly on ESXi with spherelets makes sense. And they probably had a session on Pacific at VMworld that I just missed, right? And probably many of us have missed it, but I bet I can go watch that on VMworld.com's video section, probably, if I want to learn more about that. I know you've got an article, Deploy Kubernetes on vSphere. That's just traditionally, what do I need to know in order to run it on vSphere, put the operating system in? What's different about running it on vSphere? What does this article take us through? And this is the Deploy Kubernetes on vSphere by Eric Shanks on the ithollow.com 2020, and it has an address. You can just look for it. It's on his front page. Take us through this article. This is not using spherelets. This is actually just running Kubernetes on vSphere, correct?
Yeah, exactly. This is not Project Pacific based. This is just native Kubernetes. The goal of this post was really to show you how you can stand up Kubernetes on vSphere and take advantage of that cloud provider I mentioned earlier, so that you can, if I need persistent storage for one of my containers, for example, I can call out to vSphere's API and say, hey, can you create me a virtual disk on my vSAN data store and attach it to this node because I want to use it with my pods, right? So you can do additional functionality, things like that, by using a cloud provider. So the post takes you through, setting up a load balancer for your control plane nodes, because we want things to be highly available and things. Setting up permissions in vSphere so that you can create that user that's got access to make calls on your behalf through Kubernetes, right? So this is like a Kubernetes service account that's going to be doing things in vSphere for you. And then really just kind of standing up the bits for deploying Kubernetes on the nodes and having them talk correctly to the vSphere API.
Nice. Okay, good. I see that. Nicely done. Pictures of how to do all of that, right? Like you have not only the text and how to set your domain up and do that, but you actually give nice menu shots of where to make this happen. If you're getting started and you come in and you're trying to do this, how long is it going to take you? Is this a weekend project? Is this a day project, or is it a month project?
Yeah, you can do this in a day, assuming you have a vSphere lab, already built. You can do this in a day. You can also build this without having to do any of the HA features like setting up a load balancer for your control plane nodes. You can get away with doing a single control plane node and ignore that piece. The permissions probably take longer than anything, setting those up in vSphere. But yeah, the rest of this doesn't take very long to do. As long as you've got like a Linux VM template, you can spin up several of those and run through the commands.
What's an easy way to get an application? How do I, I know there's actually setting things up, but in the end, you want to run something and actually have it work. And are there example, apps out there that I can use to test? How did you figure out what you're going to run on this thing once you get it going? Because you're actually going to run things as a container. I guess you could have any application, any Apache application you want. They would just run up, and it's just the way you're managing the launching of it, right? Or take me through, if I'm trying to understand how to do this, what would I be looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I did when I started learning this stuff is when I started learning containers, I wanted to build an app that I could use as testing. So I ended up learning, a very little bit about how to use Flask, and I built my own container that I was going to use for other things. But there's a registry. You can use Docker Hub, and it's full of different container images that people have built and published. You can pull those down. All you have to do is reference the name in your container specification, and your container runtime will go out and grab that and pull it down and use it. So you really don't even have to build a container. You just got to go find one. A common one that a lot of people use is Nginx. It just spins up a quick web server that says, hey, welcome to Nginx, basically.
Hello world. Yep.
So that's a good way to get started. We also use another one on our team called Kubernetes Up and Running. It's called QRD. And basically what it does is it's a web server as well. But when it comes up, it also gives you information about where that pod is running and some information about it. So if you're trying to troubleshoot things in your cluster, all you got to do is pull up that pod and say, oh, okay, that pod's running on this node, and it's this version, and all this other data. But those are good places to start. I would go to Docker Hub and find an image quick.
Okay, good. And I've gone through your blog article here, and can I tell you a couple things you're missing? So in case you want to do an update, the first thing I guess, like, where do I find log files, right? Because this looks all great if everything is working right? But I got to imagine that you spent your fair amount of time figuring out why things weren't working right at the beginning. And are there log files out here? I don't see it in your blog article where I would go try to figure out why things are not working.
Yep, it's not in there yet. I was actually thinking about that this morning. And quite honestly, one of those blockers, things to stop people from getting into Kubernetes, is that they just don't know where to go to get the information to fix whatever problem that they're having.
That's
I will make a note. I'll definitely get that.
That's what I found when doing it on Raspberry Pi, that once I figured out the log file hierarchy, right, of where your system log file, obviously we all know that, but then Kubernetes has log files, but so does Docker. Docker has a log file. Kubernetes has a log file. Your app might be spitting out a log file if you're running Nginx or Apache. So it's kind of like, okay, where do I need to go look? And I think Kubernetes has a couple log commands that you can run too that'll tell you status of things and where it's breaking down. So that was a learning thing for me, because one thing if it all looks right, but then another thing when you actually start to run it. Right? So good.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of overlapping pieces here too, so that can be very confusing. The kubelet obviously has a log. It runs as a system daemon. but then each one of the pods has their own logs that they log to standard out. So Docker has the command Docker logs, I believe, and you put in the name of your container, and it'll show you what logs came out of that container.
Right.
Kubernetes does the same thing. You can run kubectl logs. They'll show you the same information. You're just getting that information from two different places. But
Right.
if you didn't know that, you might think there's Docker logs and Kubernetes logs. Really, it's just that's the container log, and we're using two different methods to get that data.
Right, and there seem to be verbose options to those, right? Where the command you ran, depending on how you did the command, you got a lot of information or a little information or very little information. So it was a learning experience for me, and I don't remember everything I learned, but eventually I got a little list of things to do to go figure out what was actually happening when things were running, right? Other things that I noticed, I'll hit you now that you're here and people are listening. There was times when I just had timeouts, right? Like where at the end of it you have your, all your master nodes are ready, and then jobs are running, and you can run your your little get me status commands. But I noticed that sometimes things would just be not ready, right? And it was kind of difficult to figure out why nodes weren't coming in. I had I had firewall issues. Did you run into this, or was this just because I was doing it on Raspberry Pi, that you had some nodes that were not ready? And how do you track that stuff down?
Yeah, so the fact that Kubernetes is kind of distributed, there's a bunch of little parts that are moving around. Like the Kube API server runs in a container itself usually. So it's got its own container logs that you'd have to look at, but there might not be the logs you're looking for. You need to look for the kubelet or the controller manager or one of the other pieces. Typically, if you have nodes that are not ready, that's because there's no communication between them. So a lot of times that's a networking problem. So if you see the nodes in your cluster, but they show not ready, the first thing to check is, do I have a CNI installed, right? So maybe I deployed Calico to a couple of my nodes, but not everywhere or something, right? I've got some issue there, firewall port.
Yeah, I had things that would come up in ready state after like 45 minutes, and I could never figure out why some got ready in like 3 minutes and other ones took 45 minutes to go into ready state. And I never was able to track down what was actually happening, but that's why I go back to logs and that kind of stuff. Other question I have for you, as long as you're here, what was the other question? I had another question. Oh. Now I've forgotten the other question. We do obviously, you're going to be at... Are you going to KubeCon? That's one question. Well, I think of the other question.
I will not be at KubeCon. You're talking about the one in Europe coming up?
Yeah, the one in Europe coming up. You're not going to. They don't let you go. You're like, I don't want to go. I don't want to fly. I don't want to get near an airplane right now. Right, just because I don't want to.
Right.
I don't want to get any
that's
flu.
Kind of where my thinking is at the moment.
Right. I'll stay home.
Stay away from airports.
Right. I had a great question, and now I can't remember. I hate that when that happens. It's about Kubernetes and running it. There's just a lot of things that are moving. You have applications that are running. Oh, this is what it is. VMware. And do we have a blessed version of Kubernetes? Are you recommending what Kubernetes to actually go run? I know we have like we had one, I forget what it's, PKS or something. There was just a compiled open source is free for Kubernetes open source. You go get it. We compiled it and basically released it. Then we had an enterprise version one where we made changes and then compiled and released it. What's our story as we move forward? I know we now have Tanzu. Are we going to have VMware have a Kubernetes of record that we recommend you go start using? Or does it really even matter?
So we are a little opinionated. So like our essential PKS services right now, those come directly from the open source Kubernetes, right? And we have guidelines, and we'll sign the binaries to prove that that we blessed these and these are the right binaries. We expect that you be up to date, so you got to be within the last, I think, 2 minor release versions for support. I think. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's what it is. So we're trying to follow as closely as possible with what's going on with the upstream Kubernetes, right from open source. Once you see Project Pacific, I think Project Pacific is probably going to be a little bit different from that, but the guest clusters and everything you're going to be building are based off of that upstream Kubernetes. We're not trying to get too far away from that.
Okay. Good. So we're just taking it, compiling it, and releasing it, and trying to stay within a couple of versions of that. Other question I had is it's in your blog here, certificates, right? And when people mention certificates, I start to sweat and go like, oh no, security, here we go. Why don't you tell us? Certificates turned out to be very easy, right? It was the easiest certificate process I've ever been through. Why don't you talk a little bit about certificates so people don't freak out?
Yeah, so we've got a ton of different components that are used in a Kubernetes cluster, and all of those components need to be able to talk to each other securely. To do that, we're using certificates, and you've got to create these certificates for each one of those individual components. So the Kube API server and our kubelets, all those components are going to be talking to each other, need that certificate built. The Kube ADM tool will help build those. So if you're going through, for instance, the vSphere post that I've got on my blog on or how to build Kubernetes on vSphere, the Kube ADM tool creates those certificates and applies those to those individual pieces automatically for you. So really, you don't have a whole lot of certificate work to do unless you're going to be making a bunch of adjustments and things. The thing you might have to do later on is those certificates, I think, are by default used for a year. So if you've got that cluster up still in a year, you may have to renew those certificates.
Right.
But you've also got certificates for the applications that live inside of the cluster. There's a tool called JetStack Cert Manager that we use for that sometimes, which will automatically go out and get a certificate from, like, say, Let's Encrypt, and apply those at your ingress controller. So it kind of takes that away from something you have to do, which is a blessing because I don't like to deal with certificates if I can get away with it.
Right,
I'm the same as you.
Right, that's what I discovered. I got nervous when I started reading certificates and what I had to do, but then it turns out Kube ADM just does it, right? You just say, get me certificate, and it just goes and gets me a certificate. And then I just apply those certificates to each of my nodes, and I was good to go, right? And then if a certificate timed out for whatever reason, I just go get another one. And it was literally 10 seconds to go get another certificate and then go another minute to go apply it to a node, and I was good. And yeah, I never got into the certificate management business, right, because just my own home little lab. But I would say that was relatively easy, and it seemed to be handled by Kubernetes as a whole, right, in QADM. Yep, cool. Okay, good. All right, well, we're coming up to the top of the hour. We have a few minutes left here, and I always like to talk a little bit about, one, we know where your blog is. Julia's flashing me a sign.
Actually, I have one quick question for Eric. Hey, Eric, as I'm looking through your blog, you know, I mean, it does show kind of your path of your career and everything. What can we expect next? What are you excited about learning? What's the next phase of your career? What can we expect on your blog in the next coming months?
Sure. So you can expect to see more things about, native Kubernetes, probably logs pretty soon after this. But you're probably going to see more things in here in the next few months about things around project specific and very vSphere native type things. You'll see things around Tanzu mission control. You'll probably see some Tanzu Kubernetes grid type things in here as well in the future. A lot of it depends on kind of the things I'm working on at the time, things that are front and center. And once I figured these things out, hopefully I can write them down in a way to teach somebody else to do those same things and shortcut some of the missteps that I've taken when I was learning it myself.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that.
Great. I assume that you're going to be at VMworld at some point as you move forward here throughout the year. Any big objectives you're trying to get through? I got to assume the answer would be just, vSphere 7, we're going to be in the Kubernetes game real now. Everybody and his brother that's an IT admin will get a chance to use this stuff. But what else are you trying to accomplish, and what can the community ecosystem, the 5,000 or 6,000 people that listen to this every week, what can they be doing to move the ball forward?
Yeah, I think as Project Pacific comes out, you're going to start seeing a lot of vSphere admins that are now going to feel a little bit more comfortable diving into Kubernetes because they're going to be using familiar tools to them. Kubernetes things that have always been done through the command line will be visible to them in vSphere in a lot of cases. So I think it'll be an opportunity for a lot of VI admins who didn't know how to do anything with Kubernetes or how to talk to your application developers for them to actually be able to have these intelligent conversations and give them a jumping off point where they can learn more about Kubernetes. So I think that's where most things are going to go. Personally, that's kind of the thing I'm looking forward to, right? Is I still feel like we've got this gap between what developers have and what like vSphere infrastructure administrators know, and those two things coming together, I think they come together fairly nicely with Project Pacific. So I'm pretty excited about the things that are coming out this year.
So we did I just managed to get chat open. Sorry, chatters. Just scrolling through the chat here. Good question. One of them was, do we have to give dollars for the VMware blessed version of Kubernetes? I think the answer is yes, but I don't know that for sure.
A PKS Essentials engagement right now is a paid engagement. So that those dollars for the blessed signed binaries, the things you get with that are you get some consulting, you get CRE support. So that's ongoing support for your cluster after it's been provisioned by VMware.
Right. And I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say with regard to Project Pacific and how it's going to roll out, but my guess is that it's going to be in a bigger bundle, right? Like maybe Cloud Foundation or something like that. So it's not going to just be in bare minimum vSphere. I think there's going to be some packaging stuff that'll happen there. And I know that part of that will be handled in the March 10th announcement, so sign up for that. But I think we're going to have there Pat, Ray O'Farrell, Raghu Raghumaran, and others. Joe Beta is going to be there. So it'll be a pretty interesting announcement, and some of the packaging stuff will obviously get announced there. So that would be the answer to the will it cost more dollars? Probably will cost some more dollars, but not out of the ordinary if you're already buying NSX and VC. If you're buying the full stack, probably you'll get it. If you're buying smaller, tiny bits of the stack, probably not. But we will absolutely, for vExperts, we'll be getting licenses out. That'll we do the license for the full vSphere stack, and it will be part of that. So if you're a vExpert, you won't probably have to spend extra money there. There are questions there. I'm gonna ignore all the other questions in the chat because they're fine. The community can answer that. Yeah. There's questions there on the new licensing stuff. I don't think we're gonna get into the new licensing pricing on this podcast.
You're just trying to shield Eric from all the questions now, aren't you?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing here. Okay, so final minutes of the show because I'm now done looking at chat. Sorry, guys. One is your blog. So, Eric, thanks for being on the show. Eric Shanks, Senior Field Engineer, Cloud Native Applications, based in Chicago. What's your Twitter handle if somebody wants to buy you a beer? How do they get a hold of you, Eric?
Yeah, if there's more questions, you can hit me up on Twitter at Eric_Shanks. That's ERIC_SHANKS. Or hit me up on the blog, theithollow.com, and hopefully I can answer your question.
Yeah, that's good. And so theithollow.com, you're going to be around. I assume you'll be at VMworld, so people will be able to hook up with you there. If we allow you guys to come to VMworld, I think we do. Yeah, we're going to have a cloud native apps track this year, so hopefully you can do that. Do you, final question for you, do you actually work with real customers today, now that you're at part of VMware? As part of your gig?
Yep. As a field engineer, I'm out in the field working on paid engagements with customers and helping them stand up Kubernetes clusters and teaching and understanding those things.
Do you ever get to call Joe Beta in and do a joint presentation with him? Going, here's the author of Kubernetes, and I'm hanging with him.
I haven't yet. I think I have to go up a couple levels. It's a request from them, and they can request Joe.
That's on your bucket list. Yeah, cool. All right. Well, Eric Shanks, thanks a lot for coming on the show. It's always good to have guys, and thanks for answering all the questions I had on it. I've learned a little bit more every day, and with that, thanks a lot for being here.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
me.
Eric.
Yep. All right. Now, last but not least, Tony Foster. It is becoming barbecue season here in California because it's warm and we don't have to make snow angels out there. Any thoughts? I know you got your new barbecue platform. I don't know if you've actually opened it up yet or not, but talk barbecue.
Yeah, I've opened it. I've opened it a couple of weeks ago when we talked about me doing the pork loin. But this week I haven't had a chance to prepare anything yet. Sort of busy with the Chiefs winning the Super Bowl and everything.
That. Yeah. That Sunday. Yeah.
Did you really have to go there?
I took that, I think it's rigged. It's all rigged. The whole thing. They just wanted to make Kansas City look good. They liked the coach. It's like getting an Oscar. They just went, oh, here, let's give it to the coach. He's a nice guy.
I have a completely different opinion on that, but that's okay. Yeah, that'll be for another show.
This is my
disgruntled.
So do I. Yeah, my disgruntled San Francisco. I'm actually not a giant San Francisco fan. I am actually. What's the head coach guys there? Reeves. I like
Andy Reid.
Andy Reeves. I like him a lot. So I was kind of torn on who I was actually pulling for. So, but no, didn't do any barbecue for the game either. Which is usually we do wings or something, but we had a bunch of different places to go to. So no interesting barbecue this week, but maybe we'll get some done because it is now sunny. And I look at the weather; it's supposed to be sunny for a week and a half, 2 weeks. So I certainly will get out and do some barbecue. And with that, we are done.
Likewise.
We are done for the show. Next week, we are going to be doing show 500. Notice this was show number 499.5.
Where did the 0.5 come from?
0.5 came from Albert Einstein. He came up with it and said, this is the way that we're the gravitational well. It's only half a show today. Next week will be show 500. John Troyer is going to be with us, and we're going to be maybe getting a special guest here as well. John Troyer is a special guest, and we're going to be covering Raspberry Pi on ARM. So make sure that you join us. And by the way, we are now live streaming on YouTube. So if you are catching us on YouTube, I don't know what the URL is, but you can search on the V Community Show on YouTube. So V Community Show on YouTube. Give us a follow, and now I get to say like it and subscribe. Hit the big subscribe button right down below, and don't forget to hit the bell so you can get notified. I've always wanted to say that, and now we're going to say that.
You're going to be a YouTube star now.
Yeah, we're going to be YouTube. Actually, we're just doing it because YouTube gives us better metrics on where you bail. So if you're watching the show, Facebook doesn't tell us anything, just says views. And we don't know if somebody watched it for 10 seconds, 30 seconds, or the whole show. Facebook gives you no metrics on this. We're still going to be posting the video on Facebook, but by streaming it on YouTube, we actually...
Sharing real time on Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, so we're real time on Facebook, on Twitter. But if we host the video on YouTube and you watch it on YouTube, we can actually see where people actually bailed on the stream or how far they got when they're watching it.
Basically where they got tired of the conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So if we have 1,000 views, but everybody only watched it for 8 seconds, that tells us we should probably just stop.
That would be an indication.
Or get a new co-host. One of the two. Right.
Oh, okay, we're going there. All right.
All right. With that, we are at the top of the hour, and we are done. So thanks a lot. And yes, next week we will have John Troyer, and we will get a lot of subscribes because John Troyer is going to be back. The Troyer monster will be here. John Hu. That's right. I think his official name is now John Hu in the VMware ecosystem. Right?
I'm looking forward to meeting him.
We refused to say his name when he used to run the community podcast and he quit and he left it to me.
John.
And my boss said, you're going to have to do this. We want you to do somebody has to do the community podcast. So here I am. And John Troyer is out and about, but he will be joining us. So we will do podcast number 500. And no, I have never gotten Alex Mayer back, Tony. I'm sorry. You just not. We got John Troyer to come. That's good enough for me. And I might get Michelle Laverick yet. I'm not sure. So with that, we are going to end the call. And I hope everybody has a great week. And we'll see you again next week.
Thanks, Eric.
Recording.